Imagine this: North Korea, a nation known for its unpredictability, launches a satellite into space. Not just any satellite, but one they claim can spy on the United States and its allies. This isn't a scene from a spy thriller, but a real-life event that unfolded in late November 2023. The satellite, named Malagyong-1, was sent soaring into the sky, marking a significant technological advance for the isolated nation. The North Korean government has made some bold claims about Malagyong-1. They assert that it has already sent back detailed images of key strategic locations in the United States, including the White House, the Pentagon, and several U.S. nuclear aircraft carriers. They've even claimed to have captured images of military installations in South Korea, Guam, and Hawaii. But is Malagyong-1 truly as capable as North Korea would have us believe? Experts around the globe are skeptical. The existence of these so-called detailed images has yet to be independently verified. Furthermore, these experts are unsure if the satellite is even functioning as intended, casting doubt on its ability to capture and transmit images back to Earth. The launch of Malagyong-1 has undoubtedly raised eyebrows around the world. It has escalated tensions in a region already fraught with geopolitical complexities. The United States, in particular, has openly condemned the launch, viewing it as a provocative act and a potential threat to its national security. However, the situation is far from clear-cut. The questions continue to pile up. Is Malagyong-1 really a state-of-the-art spy satellite, or is it just a part of North Korea's grand posturing? What are the true capabilities of this mysterious object now orbiting our planet? The satellite's launch has raised tensions in the region and drawn condemnation from the United States. But is it all as it seems? Following the launch of the Malagyong-1, the global community was quick to react. South Korea, sharing a tense border with North Korea, suspended a key clause in a 2018 military agreement, resuming aerial surveillance near the border. This was a direct response to North Korea's actions, a move to safeguard their sovereignty and national security. Meanwhile, the United States, a long-standing ally of South Korea, called for an unscheduled meeting of the United Nations Security Council. The objective was clear: to discuss the recent satellite launch and its potential implications on international peace and security. The meeting saw a public exchange between the U.S. and North Korean ambassadors, a verbal tug-of-war with each side arguing their actions were merely defensive. The U.S. offered dialogue without preconditions, a proposal North Korea met with skepticism. The United States warned about a potential seventh nuclear test by North Korea, a statement that only served to heighten the tensions. But the Security Council was divided. China and Russia, two powerful members of the Council, argued that the joint military drills by the U.S. and South Korea provoked North Korea, thereby justifying their actions. On the other hand, the U.S. accused China and Russia of shielding North Korea from more sanctions, a move that could potentially embolden Pyongyang's contentious actions. This division within the Security Council raises serious concerns about the effectiveness of international diplomacy in dealing with North Korea. With each side claiming their actions are defensive, the stalemate continues. But what does this mean for the future? The implications of North Korea's satellite launch could be far-reaching and potentially dangerous. The United States has voiced concerns that this recent launch is not as innocent as it appears, suggesting that North Korea is using it as a stepping stone to advance its nuclear weapons program. This is a serious allegation, and if true, it could destabilize the delicate balance of global security. North Korea, however, vehemently denies these allegations, insisting the launch was purely for reconnaissance purposes. But the question remains, can these assertions be trusted? Adding to the complexity of the situation is the risk the launch posed to international aviation and maritime traffic. North Korea failed to issue safety notifications for the launch, which flew over Japan. This lack of communication not only violated international protocols, but also demonstrated a disregard for international safety. But the concerns don't stop there. Reports of military cooperation between North Korea and Russia have emerged. If these reports are accurate, they could have a significant impact on global security. The potential for advanced technology and strategic support from Russia could embolden North Korea, leading to increased assertiveness on the international stage. These developments underscore the serious implications of North Korea's actions. The launch of the Malagyong-1 satellite, the restoration of border guard posts, and the reported military cooperation with Russia all indicate a significant shift in North Korea's approach to its international relations. This leaves us, and the rest of the world, in a predicament. How should we interpret these actions? Are they merely an exercise of sovereignty, as North Korea claims, or are they a harbinger of a more aggressive stance? The world watches with bated breath as the situation unfolds. Could this be the start of a new era of North Korean aggression? As we grapple with the implications of North Korea's actions, several questions remain unanswered. At the heart of these uncertainties lies the true capabilities of the recently launched satellite Malagyong-1. Experts around the globe remain skeptical, and for good reason. Despite North Korea's claims of capturing detailed images of significant global landmarks and military installations, no such imagery has been released. This leads to a cloud of doubts about the satellite's actual functionality. Speculations abound about the satellite's capacity. Some experts suggest it might be capable of capturing large areas or even warships. However, the absence of clarity on its intended purpose keeps us in the dark. Is it merely a tool for reconnaissance, or does it serve a more sinister purpose? As we continue to watch and wait, we're left with a chilling question. What if North Korea's satellite is more than it seems? What if this is just the tip of the iceberg, a glimpse into a larger, more advanced program that we are yet to fully comprehend? What do you think about North Korea's recent actions? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more insightful discussions on global affairs.